Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Science News webinar. I am Carolyn Gramling, and I am the Earth and Climate Writer for Science News magazine. And with me today is Malin Pinsky, who was recognized this year in the magazine's Scientists to Watch issue. Malin is a marine ecologist at Rutgers University, where he investigates how climate change is affecting fish populations in the world's oceans. Welcome to Malin.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
So Malin, can you start by telling our viewers a little bit about what your lab does?
Yeah, so our research group studies broadly ecology and evolutionary biology. So we study the interactions between different species, so animals and plants and other species, and the interactions with their environment. And we focus...
Sorry, go ahead.
We focus in particular on how climate change is affecting fish, crustaceans, and other animals in the ocean. And some of the key findings over the last few years have been that marine animals are especially sensitive to warming, even more sensitive in many cases than animals on land. That marine species like fish are rapidly moving to new locations as ocean temperatures warm. And also that these changes are rippling throughout our society in many ways. They're affecting fishing behavior, they're affecting the food that shows up on our plates, they're even affecting international trade and international politics in some cases.
So I was wondering if you could maybe paint a little bit of a picture for some of these fish populations, how they are actually shifting around as the ocean temperatures warm. Where are some of them going, and how far are they shifting, that sort of thing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can actually put together a couple maps that I will show just to make that a little more concrete. In this particular map, we're just looking at the Northeast US. So we have Canada up at the top, got North Carolina down here at the bottom, New York City sort of right here in the middle, close to where Rutgers University is. And this map is showing in red sort of areas with high biomass or high density of a species called black sea bass. It's an important fishery species, both commercially and recreationally. And this is a map from the late 1970s. And by 2018, they had shifted all the way north from being sort of off Virginia to being off Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So it's really dramatic changes in many cases.
And this is an average annual catch? This is, where they have shifted, averaged over a year?
Great question. No, this is actually data from a fall scientific survey that the National Marine Fisheries Service conducts in the fall. And we work in collaboration with the National Marine Fisheries Service. And we put all of these maps actually up online on a website called Ocean Adapt. I've got the website over here on the right hand of the screen, oceanadapt.rutgers.edu. It's not just black sea bass, it's more than 500 different species, not just in the Northeast US, but actually on nearly every coast around the US. So lots of information provided about where species are and also how they've been moving. These are animations. I've just showed you a couple clips from that animation here.
So is temperature the only thing controlling these shifts? And if not, what other factors might be affecting large changes in movement and behavior of fish and fish?
So, temperature is one of the most pervasive ones, affecting a really wide range of species all around the world, all around the US. But there are other important ones. Temperature actually interacts in really important ways with oxygen. One of the other consequences of climate change has been declining oxygen levels in the ocean. Makes it harder, in effect, for fish and other marine animals to breathe. And that interacts with temperature because as temperatures go up, their metabolism goes up, their heart rate goes up, and they demand more oxygen. So that's why oxygen and temperature interact in important ways. But even that is not the only important one. Those are two really big ones, but fisheries can be important where their prey are found. For some marine species like whales, right? They're not as directly affected by temperature because they're warm-blooded, they're endotherms. But when their prey move, they often move with them. And we've seen that happen in Maine, we've seen that happen in California and other places.
One of the big findings that came out of your lab's work this past year, that got a lot of media attention, is that the sustainable catch of more than 100 different types of fish and shellfish is getting smaller. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sustainable catch is and how your lab determined that that is something that is going to have to be reassessed.
Right. So, in sort of a basic way, the sustainable catch is when the number of fish we take out in a year from a given population is replenished by the reproduction of that particular population. And when those two things are balanced, then the population won't continue going down. It also won't go up, but that's considered sustainable. And it ends up being, a level that we can determine based on observations of how many fish there are in the ocean, how fast they grow, and also how many fish are being caught by fisheries. So for that particular research project, we looked at 235 different populations all around the world, looked at the population levels, how fast those populations were growing, how many fish were being taken out by fisheries. And we looked at the relationship between population growth rates and the temperature of the ocean water. And what we found was that for some populations, warmer temperatures are good and actually they grow faster. But for many other populations, actually a majority, warming temperatures are actually making their populations grow more slowly. So it led globally actually to a 4% drop already in sustainable fisheries catch levels since 1930. And that's really dramatic. I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's really quite dramatic when we think about how many people rely on fish for food, about 1 in every 2 people alive today, and also just how globally traded fish are. They're really integrated into our economy.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on the Ocean Adapt and talk about some of the work that you've been doing with fisheries managers and governments to try and figure out what is sustainable to do as you call it, a fish forecast, like a weather forecast for fish. So yeah, can you sort of explain how you can work with them and what is a fish forecast? What will that be?
Yeah, it's something we're actively working on right now. Up on Ocean Adapt, we have not only maps of where species have been, but also maps of where we're projecting species are likely to be over the coming decades. Right now, these are in 20-year chunks, but one of the things we've heard from fisheries managers is that they really want nearer term information. They're curious, where are these species likely to be next year, or maybe the next few years, 5 years, 10 years. So we're actively trying to put together near term, sort of year by year fish forecasts, because that's what we've heard would be more useful. So we work quite a bit with fisheries managers at the federal level, the National Marine Fisheries Service, but also at a regional level. A lot of the fisheries regulations in the US are made by regional fisheries management councils. They're groups of fishers, other stakeholders, conservation groups, government representatives, and they really come together and make many of the hard decisions. And we try to work with them to provide some of the information they need about where fish are, where they're moving, so that they can set regulations that are most likely to meet those sustainable catch levels.
I wanted to sort of mention that your work has been incorporated into a major international climate report that came out just about a month ago or so. One of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports, this one focusing on the cryosphere and oceans. And I guess I would love for you to give a little perspective on like how does your work fit into this bigger picture of, how climate change has affected the oceans, and, what is the significance of having an ocean-focused climate report in that way?
Yeah, it is incredibly significant. Just 10 years ago, nearly all of the research on climate change impacts on species was focused on terrestrial species, species on land. And what we've learned in those last 10 years is that actually some of the most dramatic impacts, the fastest shifts in species distributions, the most sensitive species in many cases from a physiological perspective, are actually in the ocean. So this report that's come out, I think just marks a really important turning point in sort of the global understanding of how climate change impacts are playing out. And this is also really important for helping move scientific information into the policy process, because it's sort of a one-stop shop for understanding the scale of what's happening and what some of the potential solutions are.
I was going to sort of move to solutions, because that's something I think a lot of people really want to talk about and hear about. What, in your opinion, what is, you've said that one of your lab's goals is to shape more thoughtful ocean policy. What would that look like? What is a more thoughtful ocean policy?
Yeah, there are a few key areas on the policy side. We can talk maybe a little bit later about sort of what can be done at a local level or by individuals. But sustainable fisheries management and trying to understand how those sustainable catch levels change as climate changes is one incredibly important area. One of the other key things we're finding is that as fish move, when they move across political boundaries, right, they don't care about political boundaries. Those are just imaginary lines, basically, that we as humans draw on the ocean. But when they cross political boundaries, they often cause conflict, right? They open these new debates about should the people who historically had access to the fish still have access, or should the people who are closest to the fish now have access? And it's sometimes caused, in some cases, like mackerel in Iceland, it's even caused initiated trade wars and other international conflicts. So, one of the things I think we really need is better coordination and cooperation across national boundaries around fisheries management. It's been largely, though not entirely, a within nation effort.
Are there signs at this point that people might be trying to make those kind of across boundary cooperative movements or accords?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are, we already have these regional fisheries management organizations, not to be confused with sort of what happens within regions in the US, but actually across country.
Okay.
Yeah, there are cross countries under the Food and Agriculture Organization. Mm-hmm. But they're starting to address some of these issues. I think some of the countries participating in those organizations would like to address these issues more. Some would not. So it becomes something of a tension. And one of the things I hope is that making the impacts and the changes that are already occurring very clear and hard to ignore, we can help motivate some more response on the policy side as well.
Right. I just want to take a moment to remind our viewers that at this point, if you have questions for Malin that you want to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type them in, and I will try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. We actually have a reader question that's sort of a nice follow-on to what you were just saying. And this reader wanted to know if you know of any new or pending international laws or regulations that might actually aid in the goal of having those kind of cross-boundary things, like a more comprehensive law of the sea, mm-hmm. or an oceanic mm-hmm. Paris Accord or anything of that nature.
Yeah, no, there's actually ongoing discussions right now under the United Nations about a new treaty for the high seas. The law of the sea, largely the existing law of the sea under the United Nations, largely governs it happens within national waters, leaving the high seas, right? These large areas of the ocean that are outside 200 nautical miles from the coast, more of the Wild West right now. Biodiversity conservation really hasn't received anywhere near as much attention right now. So there are efforts ongoing to figure out where should we set up protected areas in the high seas, and what should be the standards and the sustainable levels of human impact in the high seas that all countries can agree on. So those negotiations actually are ongoing right now. I hope will be very productive.
Is this something that's going to be discussed in Chile, as far as you're aware, at the next UN ocean policy, the COP meeting, which I think Chile's president is calling the Blue COP?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a separate process, so I don't know specifically. But yeah, I mean, there also was just a new report that came out. There's from the United Nations high-level panel on the ocean economy, mm-hmm. talking about ocean solutions. How important human activities in the ocean can be for mitigating climate change, both for capturing carbon, but also just from reducing emissions from activities like fishing or shipping or aquaculture.
So as a way to counteract emissions.
Yeah, exactly. So that report is very directly relevant to the COP.
We do have a reader question who wanted to ask about ocean acidification. acidification. Here, let me just call this up. What are the current effects of ocean acidification on marine life? And can you explain how global warming might be acidifying the oceans?
Yeah, no, it's a really important and
Link.
often underappreciated impact, in part because it's somewhat unique to the ocean, right? It doesn't affect terrestrial species in the same way. But as carbon dioxide concentrations increase in the atmosphere, some of that carbon dioxide, about a quarter of actually the excess carbon dioxide, has been absorbed into the ocean, and that sets off a series of chemical reactions. Hydrogen ion concentrations go up, so that's what makes pH go down. That's what makes the ocean more acidic. Hydrogen ion concentrations have actually gone up by about 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But then the chemical reactions sort of continue and cascade. Carbonate ion concentrations go down. Those are incredibly important for corals to build their skeletons, clams to build their shells, as well as a wide range of other species that build shells. So it makes it more difficult for many marine species to build either their skeletons or their shells. Species like fish are a little bit less directly impacted, but they are definitely impacted by changes in their prey, and also impacts actually their sensory abilities. It affects their sense of hearing, their sense of smell. So really pervasive.
Does that make them more
impacts.
susceptible to being preyed upon as well?
And many of the experiments suggest that it does, yeah.
Another reader wants to know about ocean temperatures, how they are measured in the oceans, how in what locations they're measured and at what sort of depths.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a global network of ocean temperature observations, and it takes many different forms, from really basic technology like sticking a bucket over the side of a boat and sticking a thermometer in it, which has been going on for
yes.
totally, and
Yeah.
that's been going on for hundreds of years, and is actually really valuable as a long-term record, to large, almost nearly global measurements of ocean surface temperature from satellites. It's something that can be seen from space. Problem being that it's really just the surface. So there, especially over the last couple decades, a network of what are called Argo floats. There are these really cool buoys that float around in the ocean, and they sink down to, in some cases, very deep depths in the ocean, recording temperature and other measurements in the ocean as they go. They come back up, they transmit their results to a satellite, and then are available to scientists and everyone else all around the world, and then keep going. So there are many other technologies as well beyond that, but those are some of the big ones.
You mentioned how we have a much longer record, of course, of surface ocean temperatures, a much more complete record. Another reader has asked, are the deep oceans as affected by warming and as on the surface?
Yeah, so the impacts of warming now are being seen even all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. The amount of warming is quite a bit less, right? The heat is coming in from the surface and slowly being carried down to the depths. But even at depth, it's the warming is being seen. It's a little bit harder to detect. Our records aren't as good. It's obviously a lot harder to measure temperature at the bottom of the ocean. The records don't go back as far. They're not as global. They're more in specific places. But yes, the warming is being seen throughout the. Yeah, exactly. And it's also, we have to think about, may not be warming as much, but also it's an environment that has an extremely constant temperature just because it's so isolated from the atmosphere. So even a little bit is a lot compared to what species are used to. And also the animals and the other organisms that live down there, they rely on the food that filters down from above. And that food is very directly being affected by changing ocean conditions.
That actually segues nicely to another reader question that I had, which is, you had mentioned earlier that the growth rates for many species are slower due to warmer ocean temperatures. And this reader was asking, is this a direct result of the warming, or is it due to food availability or changes in food availability?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and still an active area of research right now. There are good reasons to think from a physiological perspective Fish are very directly affected by temperature. Basically, their metabolism goes up, their heart rate goes up when temperature goes up, but the rate at which they can pull oxygen out of the water is pretty limited, actually, and they relatively quickly hit that limit where their metabolism demands a lot of oxygen, but they can't pull it out of the water fast enough. So that's sort of a direct temperature effect. But you're right, prey are being affected, food availability is being affected, and that also has very important impacts on many fish populations. And the impacts we're observing are probably a combination of both.
Fast and Furious. So this reader wants to know, was there anything about the IPCC Oceans and Cryosphere report that surprised you, or was it, information that we already pretty much knew?
I think, even though I'm sort of embedded in this world, and this is a lot of what I study from day to day, I was just surprised at how pervasive the effects have already been, how much certainty there already is about the changes that are happening, and how certain we are about the changes we're in for. I think some of the really dramatic impacts also have to do with sea level rise. It's not just fish on the move, but also the level of the ocean coming up, already up by 6 inches, and that increases erosion, that increases flooding. I've seen news reports that parts of the Florida Keys have been flooded for parts of the last 40 days. So it's really affecting coastal communities very dramatically.
Yeah. So another reader wants to ask about the coast, how climate change might be affecting coastal vegetation, as well as vegetation in the ocean, perhaps kelp forests.
Yeah. There are sort of two impacts of climate change on kelp. One has to do with warmer waters in many cases have fewer nutrients. So from the perspective of kelp, makes it harder for them to grow, makes them more susceptible to storm by storms. And the other thing that's happened in some places, really dramatically actually on the coast of Australia and down into Tasmania, is that some of the more warm water preferring sea urchins that eat kelp have been moving towards higher latitudes and have just basically mowed down kelp forests. And just, it's a really quick transition for some of these ecosystems. And obviously kelp are really important for a wide range of other species. Many fish shelter in kelp. Many young marine animals rely on kelp as basically their nurseries.
And it's also, kelp forests are supposed to be a possible location for sequestering carbon as well. Is that?
Yeah, kelp do grow very fast. They can suck up a lot of carbon very quickly. Important question though is where that kelp goes after it's basically pulled into the kelp blade and stalk. If it just gets sort of washed offshore, eaten by bacteria, and that carbon dioxide then goes back into the atmosphere, then it's not really a long-term sink.
Effect. Yeah,
there's been more discussion about seagrass beds. The seagrass, when they die, they often actually get buried under many layers of sand, and there actually the carbon is sequestered, as well as marshes. These very low oxygen mud in marshes where carbon can get sequestered and doesn't decompose.
I want to get to a question that I think is a really one that a lot of people are wondering, which is this comes from a reader who says he teaches she teaches a marine biology course. Many of my students feel they are only one person and the changes they make are too insignificant to make a difference. What would you say to these students? What are some of the more impactful changes they can make to help preserve the oceans and biodiversity?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, I think, in terms of helping conserve the ocean, all efforts are going to start local, and they're going to start in a small community, often with one person who's dedicated and can inspire those people around them. I think that's so important. Two of the biggest threats to the ocean right now are overfishing and climate change. And there's a lot that an individual can do. Overfishing, we're consumers of seafood, so we can choose to buy sustainable sources of seafood. There's a marine stewardship label. You can often find it in the supermarket, or use something like the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch app to choose make sustainable seafood choices. And if restaurants and supermarkets aren't carrying it locally, you can ask, and try to make that change locally. And I think the other key thing is trying to reduce our impact on the climate in terms of biking more, using public transportation more, and also just making that easier within our communities. Bike paths, making public transportation more convenient. You can also choose renewable sources of electricity for school buildings, for town buildings, for our houses. It's something my wife and I have decided to do as well. So there's a lot we can do.
I have a question from Mrs. Pedak Howards. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. 6th period AP Environmental Science class. And they want to know, hi everyone. They want to know which regions of the world are most affected. I guess which parts of the ocean. Yeah.
I don't know if I can. I'm guessing the question is about climate change in particular.
I think, perhaps temperature in the oceans or acidification or ocean changes.
Yeah. So we're seeing very dramatic changes in the surface of the ocean right now. Most of the observations are from the coastal ocean. In part, that's because that's where we are the most, where we interact with them the most. So I don't know if I can point to one specific place in general, other than the tropics. It's where marine species live closest to the upper temperatures that they can tolerate. It's where coral reefs are a really important source of shelter and food for thousands of marine species. And they are also very, as we've seen in the news, very sensitive to warming temperatures with this process of now nearly global coral reef bleaching.
I have a reader who wants to know why you decided to focus on how climate change is affecting ocean life specifically.
Yeah, it was an area of research that I came into in part because I felt like there was so much attention to what was happening on land, and I was really curious about whether similar impacts were happening in the ocean. And it also seemed like an area that if we had better information on that, it could be very, very important and very useful for informing public policy. I mean, I'm inspired to do science not only by my curiosity and the chance to be creative and dive into challenging problems and getting diving deep into them, but also to provide science and new knowledge that I hope can be useful to society. So that was part of the inspiration and the motivation.
And do you yourself have a favorite fish?
I have to say, I think it would be an anemone fish. Some of the
okay.
research I do is actually on anemone fish, the cute black, white, and orange species that live on coral reefs. They are very charismatic.
Are these the same as clownfish?
Wonderful to study.
They are clownfish.
Yes.
They are clownfish.
Yes,
okay.
they are Nemo.
Nemo. Okay.
Yep. Just to be clear.
I'm assuming this reader was asking that as far as what is your favorite to study or to look at or to admire as opposed to eat.
Oh yeah, no, I have not ever eaten a clownfish.
No. Let's see. Oh, here's a great question. How do you balance the big idea with the nearly endless accumulation of specific data? How do you pull, I guess, big ideas out of that data?
Yes. I think it's one of the really fun challenges about science, right? We have to get the details right, but it's not going to be relevant unless we can see the big picture and how it fits into the larger context. So it's sort of this back and forth process of digging down into the technical details and then stepping back to understand, what does this mean? And what does it mean can be thought about in different ways. What does it mean for scientific knowledge? How does it impact other researchers? But maybe even more importantly, what does this mean for society? What does this mean for public policy?
Mm-hmm. Okay, if just a reminder, I think we're about drawing to a conclusion here, but if there's any last questions anyone would like to shoot through the Q&A chat function, please let me know. Otherwise, I just would like to say a huge thank you to Malin for tuning in and answering all of our questions and giving us so much great information about the future of fish and what we should, how we can try and contribute to sustainability. So thank you so much, Malin, for your time. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. And thanks to everyone for tuning in, for your interest.
Okay.
It's wonderful to be here.
Bye-bye.